Hello everyone and welcome to Eternalism in a Nutshell. My name is David and the title of this episode is If Only I Had Known Then in 2004 What I Know Now in 2023, Part 5. This is Episode 5. To begin with, let me state that in my opinion, queer Marxism poses the greatest threat to the church as a religious institution and to our religious freedom as Americans. I will explain why later, but for now I would like to make several observations that are important takeaways from these introductory episodes on cultural Marxism and woke activism. So let's turn to that now. It is true that religious freedom in America is under assault, and that the church has been taking incoming fire for some time now, and on all sorts of social, political, and religious issues pertaining to the family, gender identity, and same-sex marriages. But it is important that we see this incoming fire as part of a larger crisis, a national crisis, consisting in the takedown of America as a constitutional republic with its Bill of Rights. And so, to keep the proper context and perspective, I like to think of the crisis within the church as a crisis within a crisis. On the environmental side of this cultural Marxism and takedown of America, we have climate Marxism and vegan Marxism, both of which I have already spoken of. But we could also add the animal rights movement, or what I call animal Marxism, whose stated goal is to abolish the meatpacking and fur industries, as well as any use of wool, leather, and feathers. Now, it is important to understand that all these environmental issues are merely a means to an end, as cultural Marxism could care less about the environment, as is evident in Communist China, which is the largest polluter in the world and is reported to have built more than half of all the world's new coal-fired power plants in 2021. In any case, that takedown of America on the environmental side has been well underway for decades now and has led to the recent energy crisis in America, which was energy independent just a few short years ago. Now let's transition from the environmental to the social issues. Again, we have already spoken of race Marxism and queer Marxism, but we could easily add the feminist movement to the list as well, or what I call feminist Marxism, who speak of toxic masculinity and will not be satisfied until any semblance of a patriarchy within the family or church leadership has been abolished. Again, it is important to understand that all these social issues are merely a means to an end, as cultural Marxism could care less about these LGBTQ plus social issues, as is evident once again in Communist China, who have recently reported a masculinity crisis within China, which threatens their national security. And so it is reported that the Education Ministry plans to beef up gym classes after a top official said female teachers and pop culture had made boys weak, inferior, and timid. In any case, the takedown of America on the social side has been well underway for decades as well, and has led to the recent riots and violence of Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Now, to help make my point, consider the late communist and Marxist leader Deng Xiaoping, who has been credited with being the man who made modern China what it is today, and whose pragmatic approach to modernizing China are summed up in these famous words: "It doesn't matter whether a cat is white or black, as long as it catches mice." And so you see why I stated in earlier episodes that it doesn't matter to these cultural Marxists what grievance you have as long as you have one. That is, as long as you have a grievance that will contribute to the takedown of Western civilization. For in their minds, all these various woke causes are just so many different colored cats, and one colored cat or grievance is as good as another. There are two things to remember then, the first of which is that when the church gets bombarded by these culture Marxists, that regardless of how serious this crisis may appear to be at the time, that it is but a crisis within a crisis, meaning a church crisis within an even larger national crisis, and that the two are linked together in the even broader takedown of Western civilization. The second thing to remember is that whenever the church gets bombarded, it is seldom, if ever, from the environmental side of cultural Marxism, but rather from its social side. For it is these social issues wherein the church as an institution is most vulnerable to attack. And so we find these woke activists accusing the church and its orthodox members of being racist, sexist, and homophobic. Now it is at this point, when these accusations of racism, sexism, and homophobia arise, that the importance of seeing this as a crisis within a crisis comes into play. For instance, without this crisis within a crisis perspective, you might be thinking that these accusations of racism, sexism, and homophobia by these woke activists were truly about making the world a better place by their standing up for the marginalized within and without the church. And yet, with this larger perspective, we are unable to see what these various accusations really are. That is, they are but the different branches, manifestations, or colored cats of cultural Marxism. In other words, once you realize there is a much larger agenda in play, you're able to see these grievances or accusations for what they truly are, the attempted takedown of the church, America, and Western civilization. As far as the church is concerned, however, let's zero in on the social side of cultural Marxism for a moment to help clarify a few important points. On the one side of these social issues, let's place the temple and temple ordinances, with the footnote of religious liberty in peril, and that as such, our temples and temple ordinances are in peril as well. We might also add the family proclamation to the world, which we have already designated as an early warning system or canary in the coal mine, whose alteration in any meaningful way would alert us to the fact that our religious liberty is in grave danger of being lost. On the other side of these social issues, let us place priesthood ordination, along with the added footnote of religious liberty in peril, to remind us that were the family proclamation to the world to be altered or breached by pressure from the LGBTQ+ community, the next move or demand by queer Marxism would be ordination to the priesthood, the ultimate maneuver of which would be for the church to ordain a black transgender man to the priesthood. The reason this would be the ultimate maneuver on the part of these woke activists is that a black transgender man collapses all three social barriers or issues into one. For a black transgender man would not only be black, but female and queer or gay. Now, it is true that the blacks already have access to priesthood ordination, but females and active homosexuals or transgenders do not. And so woke activists would consider it a coup d'etat were such a black transgender man, who is actually a woman, to be ordained to the priesthood. In any case, we see that when it comes to these three social issues and accusations of racism, sexism, and homophobia or transphobia, that these accusations are not only uniquely tied to access to the temple and temple ordinances, but access to the priesthood and priesthood ordination as well. And so that we have blacks in the priesthood, women in the priesthood, and gays in the priesthood, all being social issues that the church has or is currently dealing with. The priesthood ban on blacks was lifted in 1978, and so these woke activists hold out hope that given enough social pressure, the priesthood ban on women and active gays could be lifted as well, and that access to the temple and temple ordinances would now be available as well. And this is why I noted earlier that I believed queer Marxism to be the greatest threat to the church as an institution and to our religious freedom as Americans. With that having been said, let us take a moment to map out the timeline of this recent transition by church leadership from being on the offense to the defense, and as it pertains to these social issues. This 15-year timeline highlights the church's recent and strategic transition from offense to defense in its ongoing battle against changing social norms, gender identity issues, and same-sex marriages. The reason this transition is significant is that it alerts us to the fact that we are losing the cultural war. The radical left and woke activists have not only captured the moral high ground on many of these social issues, but they have also crowded out individual liberty and religious freedom from the general public arena through anti-discrimination laws. We begin this timeline, then, with the church's vocal support of California's Proposition 8 ban on same-sex marriages. At this point in time, the church was clearly on the offense in the ongoing battle against changing social norms, gender identity issues, and same-sex marriages. Nonetheless, the church's vocal support for traditional marriage between one man and one woman ended up being a public relations nightmare. Although the proposition passed, it was later overturned by a federal court in 2010, which ruled that it violated the U.S. Constitution's guarantees of equal protection and due process. We move next to the Utah Compromise of 2015, which was a legislative compromise that addressed the issue of LGBT rights and religious liberty in the state of Utah. The compromise was reached by the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LGBT rights activists, and Utah lawmakers. The compromise involved the passage of two bills, one prohibiting discrimination in housing and employment based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the other protecting religious organizations and individuals from being forced to participate in activities that violate their religious beliefs. This was clearly a defensive move on the part of the church to ensure that the anti-discrimination law did not encroach on religious freedom. A few months later, the Supreme Court of the United States legalized same-sex marriages nationwide in a 5-4 decision, signaling yet another cultural war loss for traditional social norms, marriages, and family relations. This was followed up in this pivotal year of 2015 with the church's announcement and implementation of a church policy that came to be known by its detractors as the Mormon Gay Exclusionary Policy, and which declared same-sex couples to be apostates and prohibited their children from being baptized until they reached 18 years of age and disavowed their parents' same-sex relationships. The backlash was brutal and represents, perhaps, the last time the church will take the offense in its battle against changing social norms, gender identity issues, and same-sex marriages. Proof of this transition from offense to defense came in April 2019 when the church reversed its so-called Mormon Gay Exclusionary Policy and stated that children of same-sex couples could be baptized without being required to disavow their parents' relationships, although the church still considers same-sex relationships a violation of its teachings. Nonetheless, the church's reversal was clearly a defensive move and an attempt to put an end to another public relations nightmare. Let's take a moment then to consider this transition from offense to defense. Regardless of what one might think about the implementation and subsequent reversal of the Mormon gay exclusionary policy, this reversal clearly signifies a transition on the church's part from offense to defense in the ongoing cultural war. Nevertheless, let's pause for a moment to consider the difficulty the church has faced in recent times by employing a thought experiment. The experiment goes something like this. Imagine trying to formulate a church policy on social or gender norms in Sodom and Gomorrah. When you do so, you'll get an idea of the impossible position the church has been placed in. After all, if this imaginary church policy were to include any social, sexual, or gender restrictions whatsoever, it would offend someone within the LGBTQ plus community. In short, we are living in a Sodom and Gomorrah environment where heteronormativity is being replaced with transnormativity. Therefore, any church policy that does not reflect this new social norm will be called out by these woke activists as homophobic or transphobic. This puts the church in an impossible position, for they will be damned if they do comply with these new social norms by Orthodox members of the church, and damned if they don't by heterodox members and post-Mormons alike. Obviously, if truth is the standard, then the church has no choice but to put out church policies which are in line with its orthodox religious beliefs, teachings, and doctrines on social norms and gender identity issues. Nonetheless, the purpose of this thought experiment was to show what an impossible position the church has been placed in when it comes to these church policies regulating social norms and sexual behavior within the church. With that said, let's return to our timeline. The next major event on this timeline occurred in June 2022, when yet another Supreme Court decision overturned Roe v. Wade and eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion. While this may be considered a cultural victory, it did not go unnoticed by woke activists who have threatened the lives of the Supreme Court justices who ruled to overturn this long-standing decision. Another thing that did not go unnoticed by the Democrats and woke activists was Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's hint that the same-sex marriage ruling of 2015 may be revisited. This created panic within the Democratic Party, leading to a rush to pass a law, the Respect for Marriage Act, that they believed would serve as a critical safeguard in case the Supreme Court were to overturn its 2015 decision guaranteeing the right to same-sex marriage. The Church's support for the Respect for Marriage Act surprised many Orthodox members of the Church, but it can be seen as simply another defensive move on the part of the Church to protect religious freedom from within the act itself. Utah Senator Mitt Romney voted for the passage of this bill, while Senator Mike Lee voted against it, as he was unconvinced that the law would actually do what it claimed when it came to protecting religious freedom and the tax exemption status of religious organizations. I believe that Senator Lee was trying to point out that the Respect for Marriage Act threatened individual and religious freedom. Otherwise, why would the radical left have celebrated on the White House lawn after the law's passage, as if they had won the same-sex marriage lottery? Furthermore, why did so few Republicans support the bill? Additionally, if cultural Marxists and radical leftists can take away individual liberty within the much larger public sphere, then why should they be concerned about how much religious freedom remains in the much smaller private sphere? Allow me to explain. In my opinion, the Utah Compromise in 2015 and the Respect for Marriage Act in 2022 were not compromises between LGBTQ plus rights and religious liberty, where both sides won. Rather, they were moves in a high-stakes chess game for all the cultural marbles. In both cases, the church gave up a queen by recognizing LGBTQ plus rights in the public sphere and by entrenching same-sex marriages nationwide in exchange for a rook, in the hopes of fortifying what little we have left of religious liberty in the private sphere. This exchange of a queen for a rook is made evident in the fact that the radical left knows that control of the public sphere gives them power through anti-discrimination laws to completely crowd out religious freedom and limit it to the narrow confines of the private sphere. For instance, the 2015 Utah Compromise, in which anti-discrimination laws apply to the public sphere but not to the private sphere, is a prime example of giving up a queen, the much larger public sphere, for a rook, the much smaller private sphere. What I don't understand is why more members of the church do not see that the ever-intrusive anti-discrimination laws can crowd out religious freedom from the public sphere, leading to a significant loss of religious freedom. This crowding out will continue until literally nothing remains of the private sphere, and religious freedom is confined to within our hearts only, which is no religious freedom at all. In any case, regarding religious liberty, the church's transition from offense to defense, along with giving up religious freedom in the far larger public sphere in exchange for fortifying religious freedom in the smaller private sphere, is an ominous turn of events, for the giving up of a queen for a rook is not a winning strategy. Another problem with these so-called compromises between religious liberty in the private sphere and anti-discrimination laws in the public sphere is that such compromises only last as long as both parties remain satisfied with them. For instance, let's consider a ward bishop living in Provo, Utah, who also happens to own an apartment complex. Now imagine that a same-sex couple who are married moves into the area and wants to rent an apartment from this landlord. To the surprise of the bishop, the couple also wants to get married in the temple. Now, if you'll recall, the Utah Compromise and Respect for Marriage Act allows religious leaders to refuse to perform or recognize same-sex marriages based on their religious beliefs. However, these acts also prevent landlords from refusing housing to people in same-sex marriages or who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. Given this compromise between religious liberty and anti-discrimination laws, the bishop can refuse the temple marriage but must agree to the housing rental. However, the fact that the same individual can discriminate against same-sex marriages in one instance but not discriminate in another makes this compromise both messy and unsustainable. While the bishop may be content with this compromise, it is likely that the same-sex couple involved will not be satisfied and could protest as woke activists if necessary to achieve their desired goals. Once again, such compromises between religious liberty and anti-discrimination laws may buy the church some time, but they will not withstand the social pressure and the increasingly assertive and intrusive anti-discrimination laws in the long run. This turn of events is very disconcerting to those of us who value our religious liberty in both the public and private realms. Returning to this timeline, we can see that it takes us up to 2023. Now, considering that the church's last two attempts to take an offensive stance resulted in a public relations nightmare, it's quite possible that this could be the last time we ever see the church on the offensive in its ongoing battle against changing social norms, gender identity issues, and same-sex marriage laws. Now, in defense of the church, and in response to this transition from offense to defense, our church leaders may believe that the culture war has already been lost. Therefore, any opportunity they have to strengthen what little religious liberty remains by codifying it into law is a defensive move that is not only welcome, but badly needed. Ultimately, it may not be a winning strategy, but for now, it does buy us a little more time before the church divides over these divisive issues and actual persecution begins. Having said that, let's pick up this growing church crisis and divide between the Orthodox and heterodox members of the church in the next episode. Now, I know I said in the last episode that this was going to be our final introductory episode, but I have already hit the 26-minute mark, and yet this final episode goes for another 20 minutes, so I thought it would be better if I broke it up at this point. In any case, thank you for watching. Push the like button if you enjoyed this episode, and be sure to push the subscribe button. Until next time, consider the gravity of these perilous times, and remember that our children and grandchildren are depending on us to get this right and to leave them a world wherein they at least have a fighting chance.